China is one of the oldest nations of the world, and for the majority of its history, it has not only been the most populous, but most powerful nation in the world. Even today, after their century of humiliation, China has bounced back and is even threatening US dominance. But though a united China, to some extent, was always going to look like some sort of worldwide hegemon, its path towards this was quite variable, and for a long time it looked like it was going to be completely different. From 1927, even all the way up until 1948, it looked as though the Nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek were all but guaranteed to be the next rulers of China. But in a civil war that shocked the entire world, the Chinese Communist Party, the underdog, managed to defeat the internationally recognized Kuomintang and push them to Taiwan, from which point they would rule China under the People's Republic. But what if this changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the GMD were able to destroy the so-called disease of the heart before they could gain any power at all? What if, going into the Cold War, instead of Asia being dominated by communism, it was instead under the influence of a nationalist China? What if the Nationalists won the Chinese Civil War? Now, to allow the GMD to win the Civil War is remarkably easy, as basically at any point from 1927 to 1945, they could have been dealt with if the CCP had lost some crucial battles or employed the wrong strategies. Even during the second phase of the Civil War from 1945 to 1949, the CCP was clearly not favored to win, as the GMD held the majority of China proper, including basically all major population centers, had a greater army, and even had international recognition as the true government of China. So if a few more things go right for the GMD near the beginning of the war, the CCP could have collapsed. Though these are all options, I want to try to put the GMD in a situation where they can have the most legitimacy and are as minimally damaged by their conflict with the CCP as possible, to give this new GMD government a much better chance at success, while also remaining realistic. So for this scenario, the divergence point will occur in the Jiangxi Soviet in 1934, when in our timeline the CCP decided to rally behind Mao and other communist leaders who decided to abandon their positions and begin the infamous Long March. Instead, in this timeline, Mao's idea for a relocation to the north is seen as a suicide attempt with no glory, and the rest of the CCP leaders decide they would rather stay as martyrs to the revolution, which was an actual proposition in our timeline. While the Jiangxi Soviet is destroyed, Mao, along with a few loyalists, would still attempt the Long March, but with far less support, they are eventually destroyed by a GMD raid. So now, by an alternate 1935, there is no more united communist resistance within China, and Chiang Kai-shek is free to continue his policies of consolidation of the warlords and purges of the left within his own government. This does not mean, however, that he would be able to govern China better than in our timeline. Chiang's government and Chiang himself had several severe problems. Though in our timeline it is true that Chiang spent considerable time and resources on trying to quash the communists, the lack of a unified communist resistance would not pull Chiang's focus away from destroying any semblance of leftist revolts or factions across the country, which in his mind could pose a threat to his government. In addition, Chiang himself was incredibly focused on the military, and simultaneously did not care much for implementing beneficial social policies, leaving a whopping 40% of his meager budget going towards the military, bribing warlords, and towards buying weapons from the US, with almost no money going towards social welfare. All this is to say that in the short term, not much has changed. The first place we do see a major change is in Chiang's opposition to Japan's expansion into China. In our timeline, much of Japan's initial expansion was permitted by Chiang in order to continue the focus on eliminating the communists. In this timeline, Chiang will be under a lot of pressure from his warlord allies to stop Japan, though this does not prompt him to alter his response to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, as this occurs 3 years before our change. Sometime in 1935 to 1936, pressure from the cliques all around China would force Chiang to form an official alliance against the Japanese. And so, by the time the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurs, the situation in China is quite similar to our timeline. The GMD is likely to be slightly better off, but not enough to be significant, and due to this, Japan is able to make similar gains with perhaps more progress in the north due to the lack of vehement communist defense of the region. During the war, the GMD may perform slightly better than they did in our timeline, as even during the war with Japan and having already established the Second United Front, Chiang still heavily focused his efforts on weakening the communists, sacrificing territory to Japan instead. Though this would not be the case in this timeline, the inherent weakness of Chiang's army due to both a mixture of mistreatment of troops and poor strategy, the borders would not change all that much. By 1943, the Japanese would reach the height of their control in Asia, but from here, with Japanese naval dominance loosening and naval invasions of islands beginning to push the Japanese back, Japan's empire would begin to fall. Finally, in 1945, following the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the Soviet push into Manchuria, the Japanese government officially surrenders, and its troops in mainland Asia are swiftly defeated. Now in the peace deal, I expect that Manchuria itself is officially ceded to the GMD, though the Soviets would not immediately retreat from this region, while Korea is still divided along the same borders as in our timeline. Though in many other similar scenarios, the Soviets establish a puppet state in Manchuria, I believe that through a combination of overall good relations between the GMD and the USSR, and through a desire for Stalin to appeal to the Western powers, the USSR would give the territory back in full, though not without some concessions. After the official peace treaty is signed, Stalin may see an opportunity to weaken China somewhat without angering the Western allies. In exchange for leaving Manchuria, they may force the GMD to recognize the Second East Turkestan Republic, which in our timeline was just conquered by the CCP. This would be remarkably similar to something the USSR had already done a few years earlier, promising the GMD Manchuria if they recognized Mongolia, though now Stalin would actually follow through on his promises. Following the establishment of peace in Asia, the GMD would now have the difficult job of consolidating and rebuilding China after their 8 years of war. It's likely that for the rest of the decade, Chiang mostly focuses on the former, breaking down the power of the warlords through a mix of bribery, diplomacy, and military force. And by 1950, looking at the progress that Chiang made with this in our timeline, it's not hard to believe that he would be able to crush the power of the majority of the warlords in the core Chinese territory, though giving autonomy and concessions to the most powerful leaders. This would be a great political victory for Chiang, though he would remain intensely disliked by a majority of the population, as though he had won the war with the Japanese, it had arguably only been possible with Western interference. On top of this, the minimal policies that Chiang would have implemented would not have done much to improve the lives of the Chinese people. The strikes and revolts which would spawn from this would force Chiang into committing to some pretty serious reforms, including one specifically for the redistribution of land, though nowhere near as large scale as the CCP would do in our timeline, the implementation of a Western taxation system, and a pledge to end corruption and nepotism, the latter of which would take decades. It's also during these 5 years of peace where foreign investors, particularly from the US, would be allowed to invest within China, bolstering China's meager industrial capacity. Though Chiang, like in our timeline, would want to maintain control over business owners and capitalists, which would stifle economic growth. It would be around this time when the Korean War still breaks out, as Kim Il-sung would feel confident in the North's ability to defeat the South, even despite Stalin's apprehension. The war would initially play out similarly, with North Korean forces nearly pushing the South out entirely until UN forces would turn the tide to push into the North. Throughout the war, the GMD would take the opportunity to support the South by sending military and other equipment to the front line, stimulating the Chinese economy. Unlike in our timeline, the Chinese would not actively interfere in the conflict out of fear of angering the Soviets, leading to the North Korean government to fall entirely, with the South reunifying the peninsula. Sorry to interrupt the video, but since I hit 4K subscribers, I'm contractually obligated by YouTube to do that annoying thing content creators do. Did you know that almost 90% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, PS, I have a Discord, the link to which should be in the description of this video. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. Throughout the 1950s, China would continue on a relatively similar trajectory as the previous decade, with gradual domestic reform and a massive crackdown on the power of the warlords, likely also invading Tibet similarly to the PRC. One key difference to China in our timeline is that China would be connected to the international market far sooner, meaning industrial and economic growth would likely begin to occur much faster than under the PRC. However, this economic growth would be expressly limited to the coastal regions, as the majority of China would remain agrarian, without much effort from the GMD to develop these regions aside from some railway connections. Chiang would also continue in his campaigns of purging any leftist movements within China, through the implementation of the secret police, the spreading of the Blue Shirts movement across urban areas, the deepening of his cult of personality, and police and military crackdowns of demonstrations. Simultaneously, Chiang would attempt to foster traditional Chinese values and bolster nationalism by supporting the development of art, music, and literature which showcase the glory of China, as opposed to the Cultural Revolution under the CCP. He would also once again push forward a reformed version of the New Life movement, a cultural reform which aimed to spread Neo-Confucian ideals across China, which in our timeline failed to gain much traction in the 1930s due to the tenets within it being seen as quite trivial. However, now, Chiang was in a much better position to foster its growth within the population, especially developing state education facilities in urban regions. Paradoxically to his promotion of Chinese values, however, he would also permit and even encourage Christian missionaries to spread Christianity within China. China would also not suffer from the Great Chinese Famine, which was caused by the failures of the CCP's Great Leap Forward campaign. This contributes to the population being tens of millions of people larger than in our timeline by the 1970s. In the late 50s and early 60s, however, the Chinese would look south to divided Vietnam. China would begin to significantly send support to the south, as well as beginning to impose trade embargoes on the north. Eventually, following minimal southern success, the Chinese would intervene directly in the war, quickly collapsing the north and unifying the country under the Republic. The successful interference in Vietnam, and having finally crushed most of the internal opposition, would then allow for China to begin a more outward foreign policy, building a network of trade agreements and alliances all across Asia, with the Philippines, Indochina, Burma, and Korea being intertwined with China politically and economically, while Malaysia and Indonesia begin to foster relations with China out of a common anti-communist agenda. Now would be a good time to touch on the political effects of a nationalist China, as the lack of another major communist state keeps the USSR as the undisputed leader of the communist world, perhaps meaning that communist states are more united with each other against capitalism. Though, at the same time, the lack of a communist China also means that communism has less international support, and so there are fewer communist revolutions in general across the world. In the US, the internal climate would be radically changed by a lack of a Vietnam War, essentially eradicating the counterculture movement and weakening the idea of communism as a growing threat, which, though unlikely to completely discredit the domino theory, would probably contribute to a more relaxed stance taken by the US over the spread of communism. This means that the Cold War following the Cuban Missile Crisis would be much less tense. This spells a radical shift in the internal politics and culture of the US at this time, meaning that much of the specific US history following the mid-60s would be nearly unrecognizable. China would likely position itself as part of the non-aligned movement, though having clear American sympathies, and would thus conduct trade with both the communist and Western world, which would foster its economic development. China would still develop nuclear weaponry in this timeline, though it would be much slower due to a lack of Soviet assistance. But by the early 1970s, the GMD would test its first nuclear weapon. In 1975, China would undergo its greatest transformation, however, the thing that would truly allow it to be called a great power: the death of Chiang. Just as he did in our timeline, Chiang would probably die sometime during 1975 from kidney failure. After his death, his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, would take over the country. Similarly to Taiwan in our timeline, Chiang's son would probably trigger a period of reform, slowly democratizing the various provinces of the nation, strengthening social welfare programs, and removing restrictions on foreign investments and domestic business owners. Under this new regime, China would also begin a state-sponsored extraction of the mineral-rich Manchuria, and beginning more trade deals with the USSR and US simultaneously, skyrocketing the Chinese economy. China would also begin to take a more active foreign policy, actively competing with India for influence in Asia. Moving forward to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, China would probably move into the former Chinese territories of East Turkestan and Mongolia, as they would no longer be protected by the Soviets, and were considered by the nationalist Chinese government to be rightful Chinese territories. In the modern day, China would undoubtedly be the strongest economy on Earth, having surpassed the US economy sometime in the 2010s, in 2025 likely being worth around 25 trillion. The population of China as well would be far larger without the one-child policy and Great Famine, probably being somewhere between 1.6 and 1.7 billion. The GMD would also be in a far more dominant position politically, with significant influence throughout East, Central, and Southeast Asia, and investing in African nations similar to our timeline. China, despite not being communist, would still likely be authoritarian, though it would be more liberal than under Chiang, and would still be the US's #1 adversary, still probably aligning itself close with Russia. Though this seems great for China, there are many areas in which it's significantly worse than our timeline. The income inequality would be far worse, with the top 1% owning almost 25% of the nation's share of income, while the rural regions of China remain largely agrarian, with some regions even having minimal access to electricity or transportation. On top of this, in urban regions there would be a massive population problem, as the population would be far too high to house them all, contributing to high levels of homelessness. Within the Chinese government itself, it wouldn't be much better, with massive amounts of corruption, nepotism, and inefficiency within the Chinese bureaucracy. So for now, despite everything looking good on the surface, internal discontent at the growing inequalities and inefficiency of the government is causing riots across the country, and only time will tell if this Chinese domination will last. But that's all for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to see more crazy videos. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!